At 7:48 in the morning on Friday, July 17th, 2026, the seafloor off the southern coast of Mexico ripped open. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake tore through the crust near the border with Guatemala, shaking the ground so hard that people in Guatemala and El Salvador felt it too. The tremor was powerful enough to trigger a tsunami warning along the coastline and strong enough to send residents sprinting out of buildings and into open streets. But here's the strange part. Within minutes of the quake, seismologists sitting more than 1,000 miles away in California were already pulling up the seismic data. Not because their own state was in immediate danger, but because an earthquake like this one carries clues about a massive, restless network of faults that stretches across an entire ocean. In this video, we'll walk through exactly what happened off the coast of Chiapas, and more importantly, why scientists on the other side of a continent are treating it as essential information. If earthquakes and seismic science pull you in the way they pull us in, go ahead and subscribe now, because we cover major seismic events like this one every single week, breaking down what they actually mean. Let's start with the hard details of the earthquake itself, because they matter. According to the United States Geological Survey, the quake struck at a depth of around 9 miles, with its epicenter located roughly 30 miles southwest of Aguascalientes, a coastal town in the Mexican state of Chiapas. That places the rupture just offshore, in the waters near where Mexico meets Guatemala. About 30 minutes later, a significant aftershock hit, registering at magnitude 5.3, and in the hours that followed, seismologists tracking the region logged numerous additional aftershocks above magnitude 5. The shaking was intense enough that people were filmed fleeing buildings across the affected zone. The USGS gave the event a significance rating that placed it among the more notable earthquakes recorded anywhere on the planet that week. Almost immediately, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued a threat assessment for coastal areas near the epicenter, and officials across Mexico and Central America told residents near the shoreline to move inland as a precaution. In the hours right after the quake, there were no reports of major injuries, though officials continued assessing the full extent of the damage as the day unfolded. This is where the story stretches far beyond the borders of one country. If you're wondering why an earthquake in southern Mexico has scientists in California paying such close attention, smash that like button, because the answer lies in a geological feature both regions share, something researchers call the Ring of Fire. Picture a horseshoe-shaped belt of fault lines and volcanoes wrapping almost entirely around the Pacific Ocean, stretching close to 25,000 miles. It begins near the tip of South America, runs up through Central America and Mexico, follows the west coast of the United States and Canada, crosses over to Alaska, drops down through Japan, and finally curls through Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. Roughly 90% of all earthquakes on Earth occur somewhere along this single, enormous belt, along with about 2/3 of the planet's active and dormant volcanoes. It's important to understand that the Ring of Fire isn't one continuous crack in the Earth. It's actually a long chain of separate tectonic boundaries, each one shaped by different sections of oceanic plate as they collide with, slide past, or dive beneath their neighboring plates. The specific stretch responsible for Friday's earthquake near Chiapas sits along what geologists call the Middle America Trench, where the Cocos Plate is being pushed underneath the North American and Caribbean plates in a process known as subduction. This particular region has a long and well-documented reputation for producing powerful earthquakes, with a history stretching back decades. Most notably, a magnitude 8.1 earthquake struck this same general area of Chiapas in September of 2017, becoming one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded in Mexico's modern history. Before we get into exactly why California, sitting well over 1,000 miles away, treats an earthquake like this as meaningful data, make sure you've hit subscribe, because what comes next explains the real connection between these two distant regions. Here's the nuance that matters most. California does not sit on the same type of fault system as southern Mexico. The Chiapas earthquake happened along a subduction zone, where one plate dives beneath another. Most of California's seismic activity, on the other hand, comes from an entirely different kind of fault called a transform boundary. The most famous example is the San Andreas Fault, an 800-mile crack running through the state where the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate slide horizontally past each other, rather than one plunging underneath the other. That structural difference means a subduction zone earthquake in Chiapas doesn't mechanically trigger or directly connect to fault movement along the San Andreas. So why do seismologists still watch these events so closely, even without a direct physical trigger linking the two? California remains part of the same broader Ring of Fire system, and both regions sit along boundaries where the Pacific Plate interacts with its neighbors, just in different ways. Every major earthquake anywhere along this belt hands scientists fresh, real-world data about how stress builds up, releases, and sometimes shifts across enormous tectonic systems, data that researchers then use to sharpen the models and risk assessments they rely on for the fault systems sitting much closer to home. That includes the San Andreas Fault, a system that hasn't produced what geologists call the big one, an overdue and potentially catastrophic rupture that hasn't occurred in well over a century. Beyond the pure science, there's also a communication and preparedness angle behind why California pays such close attention to earthquakes happening elsewhere in the world. Every major seismic event gives officials a real-time opportunity to study how the public actually responds under pressure. How fast did people evacuate coastal areas once the tsunami warning went out? How well did emergency alert systems perform under real conditions? What kinds of structural damage occurred, and in what kinds of buildings? California's own emergency management agencies routinely study these exact details from earthquakes happening anywhere on Earth, then fold the lessons learned into their building codes, evacuation planning, and public safety campaigns. This pattern of learning from distant disasters is something seismologists have leaned on even more heavily in recent months, and there's a very specific reason for that. Make sure you're subscribed, because this next part explains why some scientists have started publicly addressing a particular kind of speculation that's been spreading online. In the weeks leading up to the Chiapas earthquake, a string of notable earthquakes had already struck in rapid succession across different parts of the world, including events in Japan, California, and Venezuela, all within a short window of each other. That kind of clustering naturally gets people asking questions. Are these earthquakes connected somehow? Does happening close together in time mean something bigger is building beneath the surface? Seismologists have addressed this directly, and their answer has been consistent. Earthquakes occurring in different regions, especially ones as geologically distinct as Venezuela, which sits in the Caribbean tectonic region rather than along the Ring of Fire, are not mechanically linked to one another. According to the scientific consensus, the apparent clustering is primarily a matter of coincidence and timing, not evidence of some larger, connected event quietly building underground. That said, scientists are careful to draw a clear line between two very different ideas: earthquakes not being causally connected to each other, and the genuine, well-documented independent seismic risk that exists in specific regions like California. California remains one of the most earthquake-prone regions in North America, and that has nothing to do with what happens in Mexico or anywhere else. It comes down to California's own well-studied network of more than 100 active faults crisscrossing the state, with the San Andreas Fault standing out as by far the most significant. Seismologists have warned for years that a major rupture along the San Andreas is a matter of when, not if, based on the fault's history and the steady, ongoing buildup of stress along its length. Some segments of the fault creep along at rates approaching 30 millimeters per year, a pace that, over decades and centuries, slowly builds toward the kind of sudden, violent release that produces the state's largest earthquakes. Experts have projected that a future rupture along this fault could exceed magnitude 9, rivaling the largest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on Earth, a scenario researchers have long referred to simply as the big one. It's worth being completely clear about what this risk does and doesn't mean in the context of Friday's earthquake in Mexico. The Chiapas event did not raise the odds of an imminent San Andreas rupture, and seismologists have consistently stated there's no mechanical link between the two fault systems. Still, the earthquake served as a vivid, real-time reminder of exactly the kind of event experts have long warned California itself remains overdue for, a reminder delivered through real footage, real evacuation stories, and real emergency response lessons, rather than as an abstract line in a scientific report. That's ultimately why an earthquake happening well over 1,000 miles from California's border still draws such close attention from scientists working there. It isn't about a direct physical connection between the two fault systems. It's about every major earthquake along the Ring of Fire adding one more data point to an ongoing global effort to understand how these massive systems behave, and about the lessons that come from watching a real earthquake unfold, lessons that abstract models alone simply can't offer. For residents in Chiapas and the surrounding region, the immediate priority now is recovery and continued monitoring for aftershocks, which seismologists say can keep occurring for months following an earthquake of this magnitude. For officials and scientists in California, the priority remains exactly what it has been for decades, using every available data point, no matter where in the world it comes from, to better prepare for an earthquake risk that has always existed much closer to home. Now let's take a closer look at what actually happens underground during a subduction zone earthquake like the one that struck Chiapas, because understanding the mechanics helps explain why these events are consistently so powerful, and why this stretch of coastline keeps producing them. Along the Middle America Trench, the Cocos Plate, a dense slab of oceanic crust, is being forced beneath the lighter North American and Caribbean plates at a slow but steady, measurable pace. As these plates grind against one another, friction locks them together temporarily, allowing enormous stress to build up over years, sometimes decades. Eventually, that stress exceeds the strength of the rock holding the plates in place, and the boundary suddenly slips, releasing all that accumulated energy in the form of seismic waves. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake like the one recorded off Chiapas releases an amount of energy roughly equivalent to more than 1 megaton of TNT, according to standard seismic scaling calculations, more than enough to produce the kind of severe, widespread shaking that sent people running into the streets across multiple countries at once. This region of Mexico has a long, well-documented history of exactly this kind of seismic activity. Back in September of 2017, an earthquake measuring magnitude 8.1 struck a similar stretch of coastline off Chiapas, becoming one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the country's modern seismic history and causing dozens of fatalities along with widespread structural damage. Seismologists studying the region have continued tracking smaller, related earthquakes in the years since, including quakes that researchers debated at the time as potential aftershocks connected to that larger 2017 rupture. That kind of long, drawn-out aftershock activity, sometimes continuing for years after a major earthquake, is a well-documented characteristic of large subduction zone events, and it's part of why seismologists keep such a close watch on this stretch of coastline even during the quiet years between headline-making earthquakes. It's also worth explaining exactly why a tsunami warning went out so quickly after Friday's earthquake, because the process behind it involves a genuinely impressive amount of coordinated, real-time science. When a large earthquake happens on or near an ocean floor, agencies like the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center immediately begin analyzing the quake's location, its depth, and the type of fault movement involved. These three factors determine whether the seafloor itself was displaced enough to actually generate a tsunami. Vertical movement of the ocean floor, common in subduction zone earthquakes where one plate suddenly lurches upward or downward relative to the other, is exactly the kind of motion capable of shoving an enormous volume of water outward in all directions, forming a tsunami. Within minutes of Friday's earthquake, warning centers had already issued threat assessments for nearby coastlines, while simultaneously confirming through additional data and modeling that the risk did not extend all the way to California's coast. That's precisely why the National Weather Service was able to quickly clarify that no threat existed for California communities specifically. That distinction matters because it shows how modern earthquake and tsunami monitoring systems work together across international borders. Seismic data from an event in Mexico gets picked up almost instantly by monitoring networks spread across the Pacific, including stations run by the USGS, NOAA, and international partner agencies, all feeding into shared systems built to assess risk for coastlines that might sit thousands of miles from the epicenter. That same infrastructure is exactly what allows scientists in California to study distant earthquakes like this one in near real time, rather than relying on delayed or secondhand reports days later. There's a broader scientific reason, too, for why researchers keep such close tabs on seismic activity across the entire Ring of Fire instead of narrowing their focus to just their own region. Plate tectonics is, at its core, a global system. While an earthquake in Chiapas doesn't mechanically trigger a rupture along the San Andreas Fault more than 1,000 miles away, both events are ultimately expressions of the exact same underlying process, the slow, continuous movement of tectonic plates across the entire planet, driven by heat and convection deep within the Earth's mantle. Studying how stress builds and releases in one closely monitored region can still sharpen scientists' broader understanding of fault behavior, rupture patterns, and aftershock sequences, insights that apply, in general terms, to fault systems elsewhere too, including California's own extensive network of active faults. It's also worth addressing a piece of public misconception that tends to resurface after high-profile earthquakes like this one. Despite what popular imagination might suggest, seismologists are clear that California will not simply break away from the rest of the continent or sink into the ocean during a major earthquake, no matter how large that earthquake eventually turns out to be. The San Andreas Fault is what's known as a strike-slip fault, meaning the plates on either side slide horizontally past one another rather than one diving beneath the other or the ground splitting open entirely. Even the most severe, historically documented earthquakes along this fault have produced ground displacement measured in feet, not the dramatic, cinematic imagery so often associated with earthquakes in movies and popular culture. Still, the real risk tied to a major San Andreas rupture remains significant and well documented. Experts have long emphasized that homes and buildings constructed before 1980, before many of California's modern seismic building codes were put in place, remain especially vulnerable to severe shaking. That's exactly why California's ongoing earthquake preparedness efforts, including building retrofitting programs, public safety drills, and early warning systems like Shake Alert remain such a consistent priority for state and local officials, informed in part by lessons pulled from major earthquakes happening all over the world, including the one that struck Chiapas on July 17th. Stepping back, it's worth pulling all these threads together to see the full picture of what Friday's earthquake actually represents. On one level, it's a straightforward, if serious, natural disaster. A magnitude 7.3 rupture off the coast of Chiapas, a tsunami warning issued, and then narrowed to the immediate region. Aftershocks rattling the area for hours and likely months afterward, and residents evacuating buildings and coastlines as a precaution. On another level, it's a data point in a much larger, ongoing global project, one where scientists across continents treat every significant earthquake as a chance to learn something new about how the Earth's crust behaves under stress. That's the real reason California pays attention to an earthquake it has no direct physical connection to. It's not about fear of some invisible chain reaction traveling underground from Chiapas to the San Andreas Fault. It's about using every available real-world example to refine models, test assumptions, and improve the tools that actually protect people when the next major earthquake strikes closer to home. This is also why the framing of earthquake coverage matters so much. It would be easy, and in some corners of the internet it's already happening, to treat a string of earthquakes in different parts of the world as some kind of ominous pattern, evidence that the planet itself is becoming more seismically active, or that one earthquake is somehow setting off another across thousands of miles. But that's not how plate tectonics works, and it's not what the science shows. Each of these fault systems, the Middle America Trench off Chiapas, the Caribbean plate boundary near Venezuela, the San Andreas Fault in California, operates independently, governed by its own local buildup of stress, its own history of rupture, and its own physical characteristics. What connects them isn't some hidden mechanical link. What connects them is that they're all part of the same planet, all driven by the same underlying process of heat and convection inside the Earth's mantle, slowly moving massive plates of crust across the surface over millions of years. Understanding that distinction, no direct connection between individual earthquakes, but a shared global system worth studying as a whole, is exactly what separates informed public understanding from speculation. It's the difference between panic driven by coincidence and preparedness driven by decades of accumulated science. And it's why, even as Chiapas works through recovery and continued aftershock monitoring in the weeks ahead, seismologists on the other side of the continent will keep watching, keep logging data, and keep feeding what they learn into the models that shape California's own earthquake readiness. Because here's the reality that sits underneath everything in this story. California's earthquake risk was never something created or worsened by what happened off the coast of Chiapas on July 17th. That risk has existed for a very long time, built into the geology of the state itself, into the more than 100 active faults crisscrossing California, and into the San Andreas Fault in particular, with its steady creep of stress accumulating year after year, decade after decade, toward an eventual release. What an earthquake like the one in Chiapas does is put that risk back into sharp focus. Not because it changes the odds, but because it reminds everyone, scientists and the public alike, what a major seismic event actually looks like when it happens in real time, with real footage, real evacuations, and real consequences. That's precisely why the response from California's scientific and emergency management community wasn't panic, but process. Within minutes of the Chiapas earthquake registering on monitoring networks, the standard, well-rehearsed sequence of analysis kicked in. Location, depth, fault type, all cross-checked against historical data for that specific stretch of the Middle America Trench. Tsunami risk modeled and narrowed down to the coastlines actually in danger. Aftershock patterns logged and compared against what happened after the 2017 magnitude 8.1 earthquake in the same general area. None of this urgency came from a belief that California itself was in danger from this particular quake. It came from the understanding that this is exactly the kind of real-world event that sharpens the tools scientists will eventually need when a major earthquake does strike much closer to home. This is also a good moment to appreciate just how much international cooperation sits quietly behind the scenes of earthquake monitoring. When the ground shook off the coast of Chiapas at 7:48 that Friday morning, the response wasn't limited to Mexican authorities alone. Seismic stations run by the USGS picked up the waves. NOAA's tsunami monitoring systems began running their own models. International partner agencies across the Pacific fed their own readings into shared networks built specifically so that no single country has to interpret a major earthquake in isolation. This is the same infrastructure that allowed officials to tell Californians within a short window that there was no tsunami threat to their coastline specifically, a reassurance based on hard data and modeling, not guesswork or general regional grouping. It's worth pausing on that point because it highlights something easy to miss in the middle of a fast-moving news story. The speed and precision with which authorities were able to rule out a California tsunami threat is itself a direct product of decades of investment in earthquake and ocean monitoring technology, investment that exists specifically because of hard lessons learned from past disasters around the Pacific. Every buoy, every seismic station, every shared data pipeline between agencies in different countries traces back to some previous earthquake or tsunami that caught people off guard and pushed governments to build better systems. In that sense, Friday's earthquake in Chiapas wasn't just tested by this infrastructure, it was also, in a smaller way, a continuation of the same long-running effort that infrastructure represents. Let's also address something that often comes up in comment sections after a story like this: the question of whether an earthquake this size, magnitude 7.3, should be considered unusual or alarming on its own terms, separate from any discussion of California or the Ring of Fire. The honest answer from seismologists is that earthquakes of this magnitude, while serious and capable of significant damage, are not statistically rare events on a global scale. Given that roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes occur somewhere along the Ring of Fire, and that the Middle America Trench specifically has a documented history of producing powerful ruptures, an earthquake in the magnitude 7 range in this exact region falls within the expected range of seismic behavior for a subduction zone with this kind of geological setup. That doesn't make it any less serious for the people living through it, and it doesn't diminish the real evacuations, real property risk, and real recovery work now underway in Chiapas. But it does mean that, from a purely scientific standpoint, this earthquake fits a known and studied pattern rather than representing some kind of unprecedented anomaly. That framing matters for public understanding, because it helps separate two very different questions that often get blurred together after a major earthquake. Is this earthquake dangerous and significant for the people directly affected by it? And does this earthquake signal some larger, escalating global threat? The answer to the first question, based on everything from the USGS's significance rating to the tsunami warning to the ongoing aftershock sequence, is clearly yes. This was a serious, significant earthquake with real consequences for people living along that stretch of coastline. The answer to the second question, based on the consistent statements from seismologists addressing the recent clustering of earthquakes in Japan, California, and Venezuela, is no. There is no scientific evidence connecting these geographically and geologically distinct events into some larger pattern, and treating them that way risks distracting from the very real, well-documented, region-specific risks that actually deserve public attention, risks like the overdue rupture along California's own San Andreas Fault. Which brings us back to where this story ultimately lands, on the ground in California, among the scientists, engineers, and emergency planners whose job it is to prepare for an earthquake risk that has existed for a very long time and will keep existing regardless of what happens anywhere else on the Ring of Fire. The Chiapas earthquake didn't create new urgency out of nothing. It reinforced urgency that was already there, grounded in geology that scientists have been studying and warning about for years. More than 100 active faults crisscross California, and among them, the San Andreas Fault remains the one experts return to again and again, an 800-mile strike-slip boundary where the Pacific Plate and North American Plate have been sliding past each other for millions of years, accumulating stress at a measurable, steady pace, some segments creeping along at close to 30 millimeters annually, a pace that eventually has to release, whether that happens in 10 years or 100. That eventual release, the scenario researchers call the big one, remains one of the most studied and anticipated seismic events in the world, precisely because so much is already known about where the stress is building and how the fault has behaved historically, even as the exact timing remains impossible to predict. This is where earthquakes like the one in Chiapas genuinely earn their place in California's own preparedness conversation, not as a warning sign that the big one is somehow closer because of what happened in Mexico, but as a working example of what a major subduction zone or strike-slip rupture actually looks like in practice. The evacuation footage, the emergency alert response times, the structural damage assessments, the aftershock sequences stretching out for months. All of it becomes raw material that California's emergency management agencies study and fold into their own building codes, their own drills, and their own early warning systems like Shake Alert, refining tools that are specifically designed to buy people crucial seconds of warning before shaking arrives. It's also worth remembering, as this story moves out of the headlines and into the recovery phase, that the people most directly affected by Friday's earthquake are in Chiapas, not California. For residents there, the coming weeks and months mean continued monitoring for aftershocks, ongoing damage assessments, and the slow work of rebuilding, all under the shadow of a region with a well-documented history of exactly this kind of seismic event, including the devastating magnitude 8.1 earthquake that struck the same general area back in September of 2017. Seismologists will keep a close eye on this stretch of coastline for a long time to come, not just because of what happened this July, but because subduction zones like the Middle America Trench have a track record of producing aftershock sequences and related seismic activity that can continue for years. And that, ultimately, is the full picture behind a headline that might otherwise seem confusing at first glance. Why would an earthquake in Mexico put California on high alert? The answer was never about a hidden fault connection stretching underground between two distant coastlines. It was about a shared global system, the Ring of Fire, where roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes occur, and about the way modern seismology treats every major event within that system as a valuable, real-world data point. It was about the international infrastructure of monitoring stations and shared data networks that allowed officials to quickly and accurately rule out any tsunami threat to California's coast while still taking the broader event seriously as a source of scientific insight. And it was about the plain fact that California's own earthquake risk, built into the geology of the San Andreas Fault and more than 100 other active faults across the state, has been there all along, quietly accumulating stress, waiting for the day scientists have warned about for decades. Friday's earthquake in Chiapas didn't change that risk. It simply reminded everyone, scientists and the public alike, exactly what that risk looks like when it finally arrives somewhere in the world. If this breakdown helped you understand how seismic events around the world actually connect, and where they genuinely don't, go ahead and make sure you're subscribed, because there are more deep dives like this one coming every single week. Hit like on your way out, and drop a comment letting me know what natural disaster topic you want covered next. I'll see you in the next video.